Hi there, this is Helen Tarrant again from Lease Here with our whole team. Wow, it's massive. Welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. You're here with Helen Tarrant, and today I'm actually going to talk about yield and returns. What would you trade off for yield and returns? So the question is, what would you trade or what would you sacrifice for return on your commercial property? Now, what is a yield? Firstly, a yield is a cash return on your commercial property. So if your rent is $30,000 net, that's after outgoings before mortgage, and you're buying the property for $1 million, that's a 3% yield. If you're buying the same property at for $500,000, that's a 6% yield. So the yield is the rent return on the purchase price of the property. So now, what would you sacrifice at? Let's say that in the market at the moment, if you want to buy in Metro, somewhere between 5.5% to 6%, but let's say for a 6% property, and what conditions and for what reason would you trade off? So sacrificing return for, and most people sacrifice returns for security, right? So what would you sacrifice? There's actually 5 things that people sacrifice returns for. And I want you to think about these 5 things and think about what you would sacrifice yield for, and for when and what and how much is really important. Would you sacrifice 1%? Would you sacrifice 2%? Would you only sacrifice 0.5% or 1/4%? See, I want you to know that. So when you go to the market or when you go to auctions or wherever you're going, right? I want you to be able to go, right, normally it's 6%, but for this type of tenant, which might be allied health, medical, I'm willing to accept 0.5% or a percentage less, right? So then you know that when you are competing, you are not blindly competing because you think you should be getting, a 6% for a medical tenant when everybody's laughing at you, right? And you don't want that, because that's a sure way to lose all the deals. So what you want is to be able to get an accurate gauge on the right kind of returns matching the type of sacrifices you're going to make because of the tenant and the security that you feel of the property. So there's actually 5. So number 1 is location. So sacrificing return for location. So if you're buying in Central Coast, Newcastle, anywhere that's not Sydney, say Brisbane, Adelaide, comparable to Sydney, you're going to be paying generally you're going to get a slightly higher return. So if you buy in Sydney as opposed to any of those areas that's not Sydney, Melbourne accepted, you are going to get a lesser return. So buying in key locations. So and even if you buy in Brisbane or Sunshine or anywhere else out of Sydney, but you're buying in a key location, you will also take a bit of a hit on your returns as well. So that's number 1. Number 2, tenant. 2 is tenant. Now, for the different type of tenant, you're going to get different types of returns. So what you find is for allied health, medical, long-term law firms, long-term tenants of financial planning, all of the tenants that pretty much was not hurt during COVID, you are going to take a hit on the yield. So you're going to receive lesser yield for the same property or the same property someone else buying next door is going to get, right? So that's number 2. Number 3 is the property type. Yes, for some of you right now in this market, you are going to think that industrial properties are going to be much safer than, say, warehouses or retail shop fronts. That you may be right, you may not be right? Time will tell, right? Don't forget, 10 years ago in Sydney, warehouses was the one property type no one wanted to invest in. It was the one property type that would stay vacant for 12 months. So, but now everyone wants warehouses, right? So don't forget, trends come in and out, right? Go full circle with property. But what kind of property would you sacrifice yield for? Is it industrial, retail, office, mixed tenancies? What exactly would you sacrifice that for? You tell me. Put it down below, right? Number 4 is the lease term. 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, right? What would you sacrifice for? So if you get a tenant on a brand new 5-year lease, would you pay for a lesser yield or return for that property compared to a tenant on a 1-year lease, 3-year lease? The answer is of course, right? If it's a normal 6% for that market, but your tenant's on a new 5-year lease, you probably get that same property for 5.5%. So you're getting less returns, but you're trading that off for security as well. And finally, upside. Number 5 is upside. What would you trade off for upside? So this is where we talk about development potential, lower rents, right? So you can redo the leases, more lettable areas you could create, and also specialty locations, right? So sometimes you need to be in that location because you know a hospital is being built and you're part of an allied health group or medical group and you need to be in that location. Well, if you need to be in that location, then you do pay a premium for that type of property, and you do pay a premium to be leasing that type of property, and you also pay a premium to be in that space and area. So it's when just like a food hub, you pay a premium to be there because there's traffic there, right? So with upsides, it's mostly people willing to overpay for the value of the property. So the value of the property might be, say, 1 or 2 million. Some people are willing to pay up to 30% more, and this is what you see this very much in auctions, but also in just off-market deals. They're typically willing to pay 30% more for that upside, and that upside could be that it's got development potential, right? In the future, you can knock it down and rebuild apartments on there. Number 2, the zoning could change. So you could make it a medical zoning or residential going into industrial zoning. Number 3, you could have anchor tenants all around you, which will bring the traffic you need for that particular tenant. So for example, if you're a doctor or a specialist, you want to be in that particular area and you'll pay the price for the rentals as well as to pay for even an owner-occupier property, just because there's a hospital and it's going to be close distance and your clients are going to be there, right? And that's the reason that typically someone will pay 30% above market for a property like that or a tenant like that. So they will be able to trade off, and yield in return becomes irrelevant, right, going forward. So those are the 5 things. So just to recap, number 1, we talk about location, key locations. What kind of locations for you? And different people are different, right? Like for example, if you're in a childcare center, you want it to be in suburbia rather than a main road. But if you're warehouse logistics, you need to be near a main road. So location for that. And when you're purchasing, depending on the type of property, certain locations are going to be more favorable compared to others, right? Tenants. Most people will want an allied health tenant, or they want a tenant like a financial planning tenant, or they want a very secure tenant going forward, and they're willing to trade off significantly the value of the actual purchase price. So they're willing to trade off on the yield, but also pay more for a tenant that is going to give them more longevity and security as well. And also property type, right? Right now, a lot of people prefer warehouse properties over anything else. So they're willing to pay a premium for warehouse properties. Now, that's very individual, and you can choose whether that's you or not. But the majority of people are paying a premium in the market at the moment to be in industrial because they feel that it is less risky. The thing's lease term. Lease term. Number 4 is lease term. Lease term is about whether you are getting 1, 3, 7, 5, 10-year lease, or maybe even 15 or 20 years if you have a childcare or a medical center or even a petrol station. But it's about getting more security in your lease and the more value of your lease the longer it is. So therefore, people are willing to pay more for a longer lease. And finally, upside. The final thing is upside. Now, upside means that, typically you could pay up to 30% more for the same property because it's got development potential, or a potential for you to re-tenant, or the potential to change the zoning of that property, or you might need to be in that specialty location. So you'll typically take a lower yield for that. Now, where the lower yield is, whether it's 0.5%, 1%, or 2%, is very individual to your needs and your long-term strategy as well. For some people, it's 0.5%. For a lot of people, it's 1%. But if you end up getting 2 of those things on the 5 list, so for example, you get a 10-year lease on a property to a medical tenant, then that's where you have the biggest movement. So if typically in the market that's a 6% yielding property, that property would typically sell for somewhere around 3.5% or 4%. If you then throw in development potential on there as well, and it's a freestanding building, then all of a sudden you probably be able to sell that property around 2 to 2.5% in this market. So that's when people go and look at it and go, oh my God, that property just sold for $2 million or $1 million or $500,000, way more than I thought, and some crazy idiot just paid for that. Well, that's because one of the 5 factors came into play, and multiple of those 5 factors came into play, which is why people just paid an exorbitant amount of money for that. But it also makes other landlords or other vendors look at it and go, shit, my property's worth, now $500,000 more or $1 million more purely because they saw the outcome, but they didn't understand the factors. And this is why I have this video, so you understand the factors. So have a think about it. Have a think about what you're willing to trade off for those yields and for security. And if you need someone to talk to, you want to talk about strategy, you want to get together and just have someone to understand where you're going and give you a bit of a long-term goal and look at where the market is and seeing if you're you're on the right path and you're looking at the right properties, then reach out to me, helentarrant.com, or email me at helen@commercialpropertycashflow.com.au, and let's jump on a strategy call. But in the meantime, don't forget to comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.